Welcome to the podcast that guides men to demystify and develop their intuition. I'm your host, Doug Beitz. Let's dig into the science and expand your horizons. My guest today, Jon Molik, is the Senior Intelligence Warrant Officer in the New York Army National Guard and former organized crime investigator in the New York State Attorney General's office, with nearly 30 years' experience working complex problem sets in challenging environments. He's also the host of Headlines and History with Jon Molik, a weekly show on which he discusses today's foreign affairs landscape, the current military conflicts within their historical context. Jon, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me, Doug. I appreciate it.
Good. And you're in New Jersey, you just said, like traveling. You just finished work, and I'm in Australia. So it's morning for me, afternoon for you.
It
And I'm
is.
curious, is there anything interesting that happened in the intelligence industry today that you could talk about?
Oh boy, in the intelligence industry today, let's say, other than the obvious of the things that have been happening, I would say here politically, I guess, in the last couple of days. Um, it would be interesting to me, intelligence-wise, but maybe boring for your audience a little bit. The Iran reelected, or not reelected, but did elect a new president, one that we in the intel community assessed would be chosen, and absolutely nothing is going to change in Iran. So there's no news but news there, if you will. And let's see what else is going on. Israel reaffirmed that they are going to engage Hezbollah in the next couple of weeks to a couple of months, and they're going to expand their operations outside of Gaza. I think that's actually a really big deal and could have some pretty stark ramifications for the region there. Those are kind of two of the things that we're really focusing on in our nerdy intel world, if you will, right now. So.
Okay. And just to give context to the viewers, it's the 18th of July in the USA right now, 19th of July here in Australia. So, because this one won't air for a month or so. So, yeah. And what about Dubai? Does any of that come into, does that bother with when Israel? Because it's just that in a month's time, I'm flying through Dubai. I've got like five-hour layover at the airport
Yeah.
there. So, or is that far enough away from those sort of conflicts?
It is geographically. Yeah, there's very little. There's a couple things about Dubai. First of all, it's not close enough geographically, and second of all, um, Dubai hasn't been targeted. The UAE hasn't been targeted directly by anyone. So there's another good point or another safe point. The other thing is that Dubai actually has a very, very robust security presence. Their law enforcement is ubiquitous, and you'll notice when you get there that there are very, very expensive security systems. Their infrastructure is very well maintained. Their vehicles are very expensive. There is very, very little that happens without the government being aware when you're, particularly in Dubai. Now, on the outskirts of the UAE, maybe not so much, but the UAE relies on tourism very heavily. And the last thing that they need is some type of a security event to, turn people away. And so, if any place, if you're going to go anywhere in the Middle East and you're going to be flying through, first of all, Dubai is beautiful, and second of all, it's relatively threat free, so you'll be good.
So it's a little bit like the Switzerland of the Arab world, where it's a bit
It,
neutral.
yeah, well, it's interesting you say that. It is neutral in the sense that they, again, particularly in Dubai, they try to keep everyone on the same page, but they have entered into these new economic relationships with Israel that have popped up over the last couple of years. If you may recall, it's one of the pushes that came out of the Trump administration that Prime Minister Netanyahu was interested in, and that is increasing economic and even potentially military relationships with the Gulf countries. And there's a lot of reasons why he's doing that. One of which is just trying to work around the Palestinian Israel issue and do that through new relationships in the Gulf. And the UAE has started agreeing to do so. As a matter of fact, I don't remember exactly when it was, 2 years ago, I think, the first time we had a flight directly from Tel Aviv to Dubai, which is the first time that had ever happened. So they're not totally neutral, but again, Dubai is like a kind of an isolated area. So
Yeah, and it's, I guess I'm just sort of referring there to my extremely limited knowledge of World War II with Switzerland, how they somehow or other dodged that bullet. And, like they
sure,
were this little financial capital. They had some reasonable cash flow, and Dubai seems to be that way too. Their cash flow's healthy, and they're able to keep that as a bit of an invisible buffer on things. So
they
yeah,
certainly do.
yeah. So war history, that's a thing for you?
Oh, sure. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's I would say so. Yeah. I
yeah,
wouldn't call myself the ultimate expert scholar for sure, but yeah, it is something that I enjoy and something I talk about, especially on the show.
yeah. So when did that become a thing for you? What age roughly?
Well, I'd always had an interest in history stuff, particularly military and conflict history ever since I was a kid, but never really paid a lot of attention to it, right? It was something kind of on the outskirts. And if I saw a war movie, that would be cool. Or if I would talk to my grandpa about war history, he had served in World War II, and so it was always intriguing, right? But I didn't put a lot of effort into it until after my first deployment into Iraq in 2005. And I realized that although I had intelligence training and I had gone to school and I had some experiences back in the United States, obviously with training and certain exercises, I didn't really grasp the depth of how much history, not only military, but cultural and social and religious and others affects the current landscape until I made it to Iraq in 2005 and realized how much I didn't know. And so I kind of took a passion. Well, it wasn't a passion yet. It was an interest and turned it kind of into a passion after my first deployment, and I've kind of been doing that ever since. So about 20 years now.
Sounds like a wise thing to do because they say people who don't study and notice history will just repeat the same mistakes that people made back then. Whereas if you do know what happened before, you're a couple of steps ahead. You can tap into the wisdom or the foolishness that happened before and
Sure.
potentially not make those same mistakes, hopefully.
Yeah, it could be apocryphal. No one really knows, but oftentimes the quote that history certainly doesn't isn't like a mirror, but it certainly rhymes. Is from Mark Twain is one that kind of sticks in my mind all of the time. That
Right.
it's just that whatever's happening today is not something that hasn't happened in the past in some manner. So
Yeah. Yeah. I get you there. I'm just curious, like I'm from Australia, so I'm interested in things to do with Australia. You're from the US and, same thing.
of course.
But have you ever studied or read much about the British and the Australian involvement in World War One?
Oh, sure. As a matter of fact, if you can label favorite, if I could put a list of favorite wars, right? Wars are awful. We all know that, but
Yeah.
interesting to read and such. World War One is probably my favorite for a lot of reasons. So, yeah, I certainly have an interest there.
Yeah, I bumped into a cousin a few years ago, and who I hadn't seen for a really long time, and her husband strongly recommended to me at that meeting that I read a book about General Monash from
Hmm.
Australia in World War One. Are you familiar with him at all?
That is a name I am not familiar with.
Yeah, very interesting. And it's not surprising that you're not interested, but I listened to the ebook.
Hmm.
It goes for about 25 hours. It's amazing. And, like I didn't realize the history in our country. Like he was from one of our states called Victoria.
Hmm.
And in that state, there's now a university named after him. There's a highway, like a long major highway named after him. And for very, very good reasons, because he was also a civil engineer as well before and after the war. Um, but because also too from the Australian side, World War One, we'd only become a nation in 1901. And was
Hmm.
it around 1914, 1915 when the war started, roughly?
14 to 18.
Yeah. So
Yep.
we were like, this brand new nation. And, England's view of Australia is they just sent all their convicts over. So that's
They
all who
certainly
we
did.
were. So we were cattle fodder. Like the British commanders took charge of all of the Australian soldiers and just sent them out, like, whether they even had bullets in their rifles, who knows, just out of the trench you lot and run. And,
Sure.
hundreds and thousands of Australian soldiers died, were just shot to pieces by the Turks and the Germans and everyone like that. But Monash came along and he won so many battles and turned World War One, but got credit for none of it because of all the British high command wouldn't acknowledge anything. It's a fascinating book. He ended up, when they captured some old German tanks that had broken down, he got the guys to um, take like all the guts out of the thing because they couldn't get these tanks working again. But it was just the physical presence of the tank, and they were able to actually make it move. And so we'd
Mm,
have all the troops running behind it. So it was sort of like just like a bit of camouflage, like a deflector from weapons. And the Germans then thought that we had dozens of tanks approaching them. None of them could fire or do anything like that, but it was just
right.
he would create all these illusions and things. And then before he became the general, he was in Gallipoli. Are you familiar with
I
that?
am.
Yeah,
I am.
and so he was sort of instrumental with one. He was one of the last people to leave the beach, and he set up all these. He because he was an engineer, he designed these little things where these tin cans had was slowly filling with drips of water, and as they would fill with drips of water, they would get weight, and then it would fire the gun. Like it would pull, the string would pull the
Sure.
trigger so that, every 10 or 15 minutes, a rifle would fire. So it appeared that all the Aussies were still in their trenches, still firing. Because for weeks before that, he'd had them keep the actual troops fire every so often. And so now it looked, so they'd all left the beach for hours, and eventually all these little things ran out, and then it's like half a day the Aussies haven't fired, and then the Turks slowly went in, and all the trenches were empty, and he'd engineered this whole thing so they could retreat off the beaches with no loss of life.
Yeah.
um,
How
and
brilliant. That what a great story.
he was the only general that had an interest in the troops, that he would calculate what time the next battle that he was going to send them into would finish. Like if it was going to finish at 4 p.m., he wanted every man within 90 minutes of 4 p.m. to have a hot meal in front of them. Like he calculated, and he would calculate how many men would die. So if he was going to use 25,000 men in a battle, he would only calculate that 100 would die. Whereas if the British were in command, half of them would die. Like, and they had
Yeah.
no, because they were just like, they were convicts. It was like, who cares? And so
Sure.
all of the troops actually rallied behind him and loved him, to the point where when the war was over, the Australian Prime Minister would not allow him to come back to the country, demanded that he go to England on deployment for a year or two. He was so afraid because there was an election coming up that he would be a write-in vote, and everyone in the country would write him in to be the new prime minister. He was so popular because everybody loved him so much, for the first and only commander to actually have an interest in the soldiers at the lowest rank to preserve their lives. So it was very interesting.
What a fascinating story, and I'd love to get the official title and read the book there because yeah, of all of the sub stories in the countries that were involved in World War One, admittedly, Australia is one that I haven't paid too much attention to because typically they weren't considered one of the movers and shakers, if you will, right? In the major primary players. And, everyone talks about the creation of the Middle East and the Sykes-Picot Agreement and all these things that become the primary. But I also love the human element in combat and how, really leadership can be easily defined in such stressful scenarios like that. And you find that there are people just like this general that you're mentioning that care and empathy even in such hellish environments, can change behaviors, and you can get into a scenario like you were saying where you only lose 100 men as opposed to 12,000 or whatever it is. And I just love stuff like that.
Yeah. And another in a different book I read once about World War One, when it was all over, of course, they decided, they're going to divide up the world now, the conquers, So for Australia, it was, Japan was defeated. And at the end of World War One, no, sorry, not Japan, sorry. Um, the Japan wanted, when things were getting divided up at the end of World War One, they wanted to take New Guinea.
Hmm.
And the Australian Prime Minister at the meeting, and the US presidents there, they were all there saying, no, we want New Guinea, we want New Guinea. And apparently, and I'm not even sure who the names of the US president or the Australian Prime Minister of the day. The US president said, such a big voice from such a small country. And the
Mm-hmm.
Australian Prime Minister said, such a big voice from a country that has sacrificed more than any country, because our population was so low and we'd lost hundreds of thousands of men. Per capita, we lost more men than any other country in World
Mm.
War One.
Right.
And it quelled everyone at the meeting, and they gave New Guinea to Australia's control, because the Australian
Right.
Prime Minister then could see what Japan was up to, because their plan was to take the whole Pacific. And if it had been given, if New Guinea had, because then in World War II, there was a whole serious battle between Australia and, well, the Aussies and other countries as well. The Americans came in like a bit later after the Aussies were there with, the battle for New Guinea.
Mm-hmm.
Because if New Guinea went, Australia was gone. If the Japanese controlled that, because I don't know if you realize, Darwin, which is in the northern part of Australia, like central Australia, but on the very northern coast.
Mm.
When the Japanese bombed Darwin, there was more bombs dropped on Darwin than the Japanese dropped on Pearl Harbor.
No, I did not know that.
Yes, we
Interesting.
know that stuff. You guys
Right,
don't.
right,
And my,
right,
my
right,
wife's
right.
grandfather, who passed away a few years ago at 100, he was there in the middle of Darwin. He came out of a
Mm.
trench with an unexploded, bomb, like when it was all over, and all that sort of stuff. It was horrendous. He said when the planes came over, they thought it was the Americans coming in because they had no food or ammunition. And
Mm.
they thinking, oh, they were all really happy when they heard the planes coming. Like, yes, Americans are finally coming to bring food. Yes. And then all of a sudden, bombs started dropping. It was horrendous. So,
Yeah, that's not the right type of food.
mm,
That's for sure.
yeah,
Oh
yeah,
man,
yes,
fascinating stuff.
yeah, yeah. So I get, we all are interested in our countries, and so yeah, we look at things from that.
Sure.
So now into law enforcement and stuff like that. And the podcast's all about intuition. So intuition in law enforcement, is that sort of something that you feel that's, been a thing in your life at all?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, in particular, that's the career experience that I was relying on when I was thinking about intuition and having this conversation, because I didn't really receive a lot of training in the military regarding intuition. It just wasn't something that was often brought up, but it was in law enforcement training, and we discussed it often because of the high let's high tempo, often high stress scenarios police officers often find themselves in, and typically from a just a regular daily schedule, and then all of a sudden a light switch flips, right, and now you find yourself in a potentially shoot don't shoot scenario, or you're chasing somebody down the street in a vehicle or something. And so you're often going from zero stress to 100% stress, and then your mind relies on intuition in order for you to navigate that environment, right, navigate that scenario. And we were always taught by the senior officers that ran the academy that intuition was a combination of your experience, um, or is at least a foundation built on your experience that the mind could remember, but you couldn't process on your own. So it wasn't something ethereal in a way, but it was again an experience from your training, or another scenario you happened to be involved in the past, but you were using that experience to make choices in a stressful environment, and we were taught to rely upon that. And if it felt like it made sense, then you should act upon that because it wasn't coming out of thin air. Again, it was based on something that you had been taught, even though you could not articulate that in the moment. And oftentimes you can't articulate it after the moment either when something is involved. Again, let's say you're in a shoot don't shoot scenario, or you ended up engaging someone and you had to fire your weapon. You go through all of these conversations and therapy and all these things afterwards, and still many law enforcement officers say, I don't know why I turned left in this moment, and I don't know why I chose that path to chase them, and or whatever it is. And it ends up often being based on, again, that training and experience, and we called that intuition.
Mm. And I guess I'm just curious your interpretation, your thoughts on it. Like for my interpretation of intuition is there is an unseen force, realm, intelligence, whatever it may be, that's out there that is trying to get information to us to help us because it likes us. Does that make sense to you?
It it does make sense to me. I don't know if I hold the same um thought process. I don't know if I would articulate it in that way. I would probably articulate it more to something more mathematical and um I don't want to call it scientific, but more maybe biological, right? That because we've experienced, let's say, placing myself in this law enforcement scenario, because I've gone through training, both physical and mental, and may have had experiences in this environment in the past. Just because I can't make a direct connection to that data that resides somewhere in the brain, meaning I can't consciously find it, it makes itself known when the brain needs it to be known, right? And when you enter into that fight or flight scenario and the brain, the blood patterns shift and you lose feeling in your fingers, and your blood ends up becoming more concentrated in the brain and more concentrated in the key organs in the body, because there's only certain things that you need to operate in that kind of moment. That when that happens, the brain again, it transitions itself into survival mode. And what is it that's inside here that I can rely upon to ensure that I survive in this moment? And again, it makes itself known. Now, I'm not a scientist and I couldn't prove that at all, but that's just a gut feeling, if you will, that's how I would articulate it, I guess.
Yeah. No, I love that because in the intro to the podcast, it says like, let's get into the science of it. So
Sure.
I love the science of it, and to hear about that side of the whole thing, it's like, and I've read and listened to a lot of information from doctors and scientific people about how things do and don't work. But something you mentioned there is, like there's information in our brain that we can't access, but when we do need to access it, we're able to. But then a step beyond that, like you were talking about, you said, some of the guys would say, I don't know why I went left or right. If you came to a T section in an alley when you were chasing someone and you looked right and left and they were out of sight, but you knew to go right, that's really actually not in your brain because that's none of your training can tell you that it's there. But so some parts of your training are, I can jump that fence. I know I can go over a 8 foot fence. 12-foot fence, I know I can't get over that. Like whatever. That's from years ago. You did physical training. You know what you can quickly leap up and over safely. But and so yes, what you're saying is that information's there, and I've just tapped into something from 12 years ago when I was doing some training. I know I can physically do that. I know that's the most advantageous thing right now. But then there's other things that pop in, and to me, from this unseen realm, and it just some things like go right, and you go right, and something it's you catch the person off guard up the other end, because they're hiding around the corner up there. Um, and that's what I love is there's, it's because it's for everyone's, I guess, betterment that you do catch someone who's attempting to harm people, etc. So it's the ultimate good. And I'm curious with, for me with intuition, it can tend sometimes to come with emotions. Emotions can sometimes come with empathy. Do you, when you're tracking someone down and it's taking days or weeks or longer to track them down or wherever, things like that, or if you do find someone, you've got them right now, cuffs are on, whatever, um, are you ever able to have empathy for those people?
Wow, great question. And I would say yes. And it's easy for me to say yes today. I was in the law enforcement world for 14 years out of my total military life. And being a National Guard soldier, I at times in my career was full-time, and that was what I did every single day. And there were times in my life when I was just part-time and doing my 1 weekend a month and 2 weeks in the summer, what us National Guard folks do in the US. And so for 14 years, I did the part-time Army thing and the full-time cop thing, right? So in the beginning of those 14 years, my answer would have been I don't know, or it would depend on the scenario. But it's easy for me to say after that time to say yes. And I attribute that not only to spending 14 years with people on a day-to-day basis almost who are struggling with regular life events that may find themselves in trouble with the law, and it's not necessarily because they're evil or bad people or in any way. But also because I happened to go on a journey personally during that time where I I relied on empathy from others as I was going through some of my own personal struggles. And, because of that personal experience where I realized that what the power of empathy from others and that I needed it, that I needed to be able to give that to others so I could understand their plight and their challenges and their struggles. And so eh, I had to go through that on my own to get there, but I did. And so, I'm actually very confident in saying yes. I again towards the end of my career, very easy for me to look at someone and say, I understand.
Okay. Yeah, well, that's nice. Yeah, because it's I know, like I used to be a professional firefighter, and we would, around the station, we'd have a lot of downtime. Firefighters only respond to emergencies 3% of their working day.
Yeah.
The rest of the time, we're training, cleaning, learning how to play table
Sleeping,
tennis, snooker, volleyball. It's
cooking.
yeah, having big cook-ups. Yeah, and that's a
Yeah.
camaraderie
Yeah.
thing. That's all, cool thing to do. But yeah, and sometimes, yeah, there'd be a real lack of empathy when we were discussing things with the guys. And back in, it's 20 years since I was a professional firefighter. So back then it was officially a boys' club. The female firefighters came along a year or two after I left, and yeah, it was a real boys' club. And yes, it would be a much lower number of the guys who would have empathy, in general for other staff members, etc. Yeah, it was yeah, yeah, interesting. And
Listen, I can attest from my time that again, I only left law enforcement 2 years ago, and I was there were certainly law enforcement officers, cops that I had worked with. So, first of all, still a boys' club. There were plenty female officers, but they find themselves having to work through the challenges of working in a boys' club. I mean, some things have changed, and we don't, cops don't say certain things anymore, and we don't act certain ways and whatever, right? Because there's females around, and that's the way it should be. But it's certainly not everything isn't all cleaned up, let's put it that way. And this percentage of those that I worked with that would easily answer with yes in relation to having empathy would still be pretty small. And I worked with some really challenging folks who, regardless of how often we would discuss things like, empathy and, hey, it's not really that 4-year-old child's fault that they're in that scenario and their mom is whatever it is. And they just weren't willing to listen. So that's still a real challenge.
Yeah. And I can count on one hand the number of officers who, like more senior officers who were awesome. Like when they would turn up on a fire ground, like when it was all hit the fan, there's half a dozen fire engines there. Like we've got a prolonged incident that is going to be difficult to bring under control. It's not going to happen in the next hour. There's very few senior officers that would turn up in their car and take control of the thing where everyone would look at and go, oh, thank God you're here. Like,
Mm.
whereas a lot of them, the guys would look at them, turn up, and they'd be like, right, this is going to be even more of a circus than it is now. And those guys, I got to know a couple of those guys personally and very well, who could command 40 or 50 guys and just call it, they could just, and these guys had empathy and they were intuitive and they could slow the whole scene down. They could calm everyone down. They could make everyone work slower and get the job done 5 times faster. It was just, they're amazing. And they're very few and far between. But yeah, they were the guys. They had empathy for people. They could see a bigger picture of it all. And I guess that's what I'm trying to promote with intuition is it's something to be developed. It's a scientific thing. And if you do have it, it makes your life easier. And for me personally, I enjoy being around men who have empathy. And I enjoy being around men who have a higher than normal level of intuition because they're not going to say stupid shit as often. You know, like I'm developing my intuition as much as I can, as fast as I can, and I still say a lot of stupid shit. I do, but I say a lot less than I used to. I used to be ridiculous. It just, I believe I'm nicer to be around now than I used to be. Occasionally I've been married almost 40 years, and occasionally my wife will comment on my personal development over the last few years. She doesn't say anything about it very often, but it's complimentary when she does say it. And it's like, wow, if she's noticed it and she's willing to say it, it's noteworthy. It's yeah. She doesn't have to court me anymore. She's got me hook, line, and sinker. I'm hanging around. She doesn't have to
Yeah,
sort of
right.
say nice things to keep me around. And yeah, it's just so it's I just think it's a great thing for men. Like it's just live a happier life. Like life is just better than yeah.
Yeah, I can agree with you from a military standpoint too. And leadership is such a big part of the military for obvious reasons. And men and women find themselves in positions where they're in command of many, many, many soldiers, depending on the echelon they're working at. And I would agree that those that have more of an open mind, that are potentially more empathetic and more intuitive, then they command better and they do things just like you had said. They are able to calm in a stressful scenario, and they're able to organize people much more effectively and efficiently than those that seem to be closed-minded. Those that are closed-minded seem to be more stressed, and they have less ability to manage chaos. And I don't, I just I agree, I guess, from my perspective too. So that's helped me in my leadership as well. There is no doubt, in the position that I hold currently, both in my full-time position. It's kind of weird to describe on the Army side because I have, obviously I'm in and I work full time doing intel stuff, and I'm in charge of an office full of people, both civilians and military. But then on the weekends, when I do other Army stuff, other Army intelligence stuff, I'm often in charge of much larger groups of people, potentially up to 150 soldiers at a time. And I have found that as not only did I become a better investigator as I grew in my ability to be empathic for others, I was also much better at being a leader of soldiers because of that. I can see the challenges and the problems of soldiers and not just disregard when something was wrong, right? If a soldier was showing up late, or if I can notice that their production was down or whatever, if I could stop, take a breath, open up the empathy box and say, let's try to figure out what this challenge is and look at the challenge from their perspective. We could get them on the right track, and it's worked well.
Yeah. So you mentioned earlier that some of your empathy came with years ago, you were going through a bit of a rough patch. Um, so how, and you noticed people were offering empathy to you. Was it sort of like in a mentoring way, or was it just something you observed, or and then how did you develop that empathy in yourself? I'm curious.
Well, so it's I noticed the empathy through a lack of action. And what I mean by that is, some of the behavior that I was involved in because I was drinking, and I was drinking way too much, and I was drinking during times that I shouldn't have been drinking, and it was, and there's a whole story behind that. But, some of the behaviors again that I was expressing and I was involved in, really could have and potentially should have resulted in loss of marriage, loss of job, loss of military position, loss of all of these things, right? I should have been able to find, or it would have been fair, let's put it this way, if I found myself in those scenarios, right? Single, homeless, jobless, all of these things. And none of that happened. And it didn't happen. I mean, potentially some of it is luck, but it didn't happen because the people that were in my life made a choice not to allow that to happen. My wife didn't leave, and my boss didn't fire me, and the army didn't kick me out the back door. And sometimes it was direct in that people would approach and say, listen, this isn't good, and what can I do to help? But really most of it was like, I'm going to allow this person to work through these challenges, and I'm not going to make it any worse by, again, my wife divorcing me or my job firing me or something like that. So I attribute that to empathy, that they were willing to take a step back and say, I'm just going to let this thing process because he's obviously challenged. He's not a bad person. He's just struggling. And so when I don't think I can articulate directly how that then that thought process or those experiences then transferred themselves into me becoming more empathetic. I just did. When the brain cleared and I don't drink anymore and I haven't drank now for almost 8 years, then it just became more um a more ready emotion. It was just there. And I noticed that I was, again, more empathic in certain scenarios. And I just attribute it to the only other thing that was happening in my life that changed was my behavior and then potentially the empathy towards me. So that's just the way I attribute it. That it must have been that led me to be more empathetic.
Yeah. So I'm curious, you used the word emotions there, and it's a favorite thing that I like to talk about, because it's a thing that's scary to a lot of men to talk about. But I don't, I used to view them as scary.
Hmm.
And but I've just learnt to become a bit more vulnerable and open up and talk about emotions. And I'm curious there, obviously, when you were drinking, there was some emotion that you maybe weren't enjoying. And I'm not going to use the word good or bad emotion. It's just like ones we
Hmm.
enjoy, ones we don't enjoy. So possibly you were having emotions you didn't enjoy, and were you then drinking to try and make those emotions go away?
Um, I would say potentially. Um, I haven't admittedly, I haven't gone through and done a full um, calculation, if you will, a full investigation of all of the reasons why um, that happened. Excuse me. Sorry about that. Why that happened. There's correlations to life events. I mean, it was obvious to me that the amount that I was drinking increased shortly after my second deployment. 2012, I went to Afghanistan and spent almost 10 months there, and in probably the most challenging deployment and professional experience in my life. And um, it was the timing was just right. And there were a lot of things going on in my life at the time. I had a very young family. I had a younger marriage. I left to go to Afghanistan 3 days after my daughter was born. So I didn't see her the first year that she was there. That was a challenge, clearly. And I then I entered into a part of my military, or excuse me, my law enforcement career that became a real challenge as well. Some of my very close friends in the office and my boss that had hired me, they moved on, and some people that I had worked with in the past and I was just not on a didn't have good relationships with, and they ended up coming into my office, and one of them ended up becoming my supervisor, and so just a whole host of things started happening in and around this period. And it just it got to me, and now I couldn't articulate that in the moment. It I knew things were just kind of busy and things weren't great at the time, but I wasn't saying to myself, well, so I'm going to go home and drink more beers tonight because of that. It didn't work that way. It just was what it was. And then, I eventually ended up in a rehab facility for a few weeks, and obviously got sober and spent some time doing some investigation and calculating and things, but I never worked through it wholly, right, in any comprehensive way. And so in the short amount of effort I put in, I was able to at least identify that was a 4 or 5 year chunk in my life where I was as challenged and as stressed as I ever have been and probably ever will be,
Mm.
hopefully.
So,
Yeah.
and so you then stopped the alcohol cold turkey. Just,
Uh yeah. Yes. Yeah, it was there's a term that they use in AA, which is I was sick and tired of being sick and tired. That's kind of something they say. AA is known for all of their sayings, right? That just happens to be one that sticks with me because, in my experience, that's what happened to me. That, I was at a point. And it was drinking so often and so many hours of every day that I was exerting so much energy to find drink and drink without people knowing, and it was exhausting. It was exhausting, and then at the same time trying to fight the urge to do so, which that's exhausting in and of itself, and then you can't do whatever. So I noticed towards the end of the last few months that really became very real to me, that I was wiped out and I didn't know what to do anymore. I really didn't know what to do. I just knew that I wasn't going to stop, right? But um some day came and I don't know why it was this day. To this day I could not tell you why. But um I was supposed to be at work. I was 10:30, 11 o'clock in the morning. I was supposed to be at work at 9 o'clock in the morning. I wasn't at work. I was at home in my bed. I had been drinking already for 4 hours that day. I was getting ready to just call in to work again, which probably would have been the 100th time, in the last couple of years where I just, whatever. And I don't know why, but that day something happened, and I just said to my wife, I think she was probably upset at me at some point in the day, and I just said I can't do this anymore. And so she said, "Well, let's stop and let's take you somewhere and see if you can get this thing figured out." And so I did, and knock on fake wood here that I'm still in that same place. So
yeah. And we talked before about science and alcohol.
Mhm.
Was it like spirits or beer or what was or a mixture?
Yeah, I was much more of a beer and a wine guy.
Yeah. Okay.
Um,
So they're both chemicals. and they're in your body and they're reacting. I mean, like all foods get processed through our body, and so they have their own frequency. And when you've chosen to stop them, this is how I think, and I'm not saying this is correct, because I stopped eating certain types of food in about 2010, and I had a big change. I didn't plan to have a big change, but it just did. So I can see like stopping the chemical of beer and wine in your body. It's like, imagine like I'm a fair bit older than you. My first car had a very old radio with a dial. Then we went to push buttons. But if you went back, did you ever have a car with a dial for the radio?
I didn't have one myself, but my grandparents did.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So showing age
Well,
here.
well, listen, let me back up here. It did have a dial, but still was digital. But I did ride in vehicles from the
Yeah,
70s when I was a
yeah,
kid that was analog dial with the little white line, and you press
yeah,
the button and it forced the yep,
yeah.
I'm
And
tracking.
so, but if you didn't press the button, you could dial it. And when you dialed it, you got static,
Of course. Of
right?
course.
And then when you got to the next station, you got what you wanted. So what I'm inferring here is the beer and the wine was causing static and making the message come through, not one that you want. Like so,
Oh, sure.
and we talk about intuition. Are we gonna be tapping into some benevolent force when there's static, that all we can hear is static coming through the radio? It's like, yuck. We're confused. We're mixed up. We've got no message that is coherent to us. So now we get to a station. So we're stopping the beer and wine. Now all of a sudden we've gone from, like when I was a kid, we only had AM radio. But as I got older, we got FM as well. So now I had like a choice between AM and FM. So to me, you stopping the beer and wine, you've now just installed a AM FM radio in your car. You can now
Mm.
access, instead of like 10 stations, you can now access 50. And you've got new messages, you've got new information that can come through. Because I know back in 2010, I was sick and tired. As you said, we get to the point where we're sick and tired. I was sick and tired of the food I was eating. I was very disgruntled with it. And I read a book, and in the book, it's talked about the disadvantages to our physical bodies of eating processed food. So
Mm.
basically, overnight, almost, much to my family's disgust, because it was quite difficult, I decided to stop as far as possible as I could eating processed food. Anything that was in a can or a box or a package, it
Mm.
had been, it's like, I'm going to try and just eat the other. So I took those foods out of my life, and I believe it, like you cut the alcohol out, it dropped a lot of static off, and it allowed, because within months, all of a sudden I saw the world differently. It was like, wow, like like what's going on? It's like I'm sort of like, it's not like I was on a different planet, but it was like everything around me had changed, and I saw things very differently. And there was no instant process. This didn't happen in days. It happened over months, 3 or 4 months. And so I believe you, and I'm not demonizing alcohol for people, or anything like that. I'm just suggesting you had a big change in the what went into your body. And to me, it would create a change like that where you could become empathetic, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would, the way it was described to me by the doctors that I was working with, or that were working with me, um, is that, the brain's malleable, and you develop pathways in the brain based on certain behaviors and experiences. That's why everybody's brain in the world is different, because everyone's experiences are different. And when you drink, or when you engage in any real behavior, your any behavior, whether good or bad, new pathways are constructed that help um, deal with whatever this behavior is. Again, if it's good, it's because you're exercising and you're building these pathways and whatever. And it can be bad if you fill yourself with poison all of the time, poison that is potentially addictive, then you develop pathways where the brain wants more and more and more of these things. And it's one of the challenges with addiction, particularly with alcohol, but really with anything you're addicted to, is that if you continue to do that and it continues to provide a dopamine response, then the brain is going to generate those neurogenic pathways, so you get more dopamine, and they want you to keep doing the same thing over and over and over. And one of the only ways to defeat that increase in those pathways is to stop doing what you're doing, so new pathways can be gained, so the brain can find dopamine elsewhere and not in the behavior that you currently have. And so they and one of the ways one of the reasons early sobriety is so challenging and it becomes easier over time is not so much because it's just in the past. It really has a biological reason, and that is the more times you tell the brain no, when in the beginning it's telling you yes, but you say, no, I'm not doing it, that those neurological pathways begin to die off because they don't provide the brain any benefit. So they then go again and they generate new ones looking for that dopamine response. And it ends up that those new pathways lead to more healthy behavior. And so it becomes less difficult to say no over time because fewer pathways are asking you to fill them or to meet their requirement, whatever it is. So, but yeah, I guess two different ways to explain the same thing. And then, the because there was so much, I would even say caloric energy, everything that I was doing during the day was focused on continuing to drink and maintaining that status, that there just wasn't enough energy and processing, and again, caloric processing, if you will. Everything the brain was doing was working to continue the drinking, that I was shattered in all other aspects. I couldn't think properly. I couldn't read. I couldn't do all the things that I enjoyed because the brain wasn't interested in doing any of that. The brain was just interested in drinking. And so again, those pathways are gone. The newer pathways are either reestablished, the ones that I used to use, or the new ones are there. And now I'm things are more clear. Now I enjoy reading again. And now, I'm in a position having this conversation with you. I would have not have been in this position 9 years ago. We would not have been talking. It would not have been anything on my radar because I just would have been drinking.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and I love how you've described that. That's why I have these conversations, to get a whole different view on how things happen, why they happen, etc. And I know there's men out there listening who are relating to what you're saying. They're like, oh, that makes sense. Like I've heard Doug talk about this before, but now Jon's just said it. It's like that just took it to a whole different level. Like, so that, yeah, I love that.
Mm.
I'm curious, the guys you work with now, if they listen to this podcast, would they roll their eyes or would they be on board?
Ooh, when you say that, what do you mean from what I've said, from what you've said, a combination of both? What do you
Our
what do you mean?
conversation in general, would they go like, Jon's lost the plot, or would they be going like, yeah, that's Jon's, I'm on board with what Jon's saying. So I'm just curious, the people that you work with now, are they intuitive, empathetic type people, or would they think this conversation was out there and not something to embrace?
No, they would certainly, the vast majority would be on board with the conversation. And that's one of the relaxing is a way that I would stress reducing feeling that I have in the current position that I'm in. When I left law enforcement 2 years ago, it wasn't because I didn't like the job, because I did like the job. And even though I had been sober for the last few years of my career, I was still surrounded by those people that were a real challenge. And it wasn't only that we didn't get along personally, and sometimes you just don't get along with people. We don't see the world in the same way. Um, they, the majority of them don't think the way that you and I would think, even though you and I may approach our version of intuition differently. We still make this connection and understand that it's a real thing and it benefits people. They wouldn't even be interested in this conversation. This would be boring to them. It would be nonsense. What they should be doing is probably working out and shooting more guns or something, right? But my friends that I have in the military, that interestingly, the friends that I work with today, every single day, now that I'm back doing Army stuff full time, they've been my friends for years in the past. I just would only see them on a part-time basis. But they are the type of people that I have more of a connection with, and they think more like I do. And so, even though we work in a military environment and people think the military is, it's very strict, right? And we are in our uniforms and we're marching and we yell and we say "Kua" and all these things. And, and there are times when that is true, and we have to get into the field and we have to do dangerous things, and that happens, right? But then they're also real human beings. And, um, yeah, so I would say they'd be interested. And as a matter of fact, I'm sure when this podcast comes out, they're actually very supportive as well. And I'm sure they'll listen and say, hey, because they ask me all the time if I do another interview, they're like, hey, did you talk to somebody last week? If you did, and I said, yeah, this is good. I was on this show and I talked about this stuff, and they'll listen and they enjoy it. And then they'll ask me questions about it. And so, yeah, that's a long answer to say yes, they would
Yeah.
enjoy it.
So is it just because of the type of guys, the type of training they've had, or do you think the world's changed that much? Because if you went back 15, 20 years ago, same type of group of guys, would you think they would be on board with intuition stuff? Or do you think the world has changed? Or is it just these guys in this type of employment think this way?
A good question. I would say it's a little bit of both, but mainly the profession, because um I've been in the Army almost now 30 years. And so I can say to you that nearly 30 years ago that there was a different general mindset of the people that I had worked with, that I would say would be less empathetic. I think, as a matter of fact, I think 9/11 actually really changed that landscape for the military in a lot of ways, and our multiple deployments downrange. But um, however, when I find myself outside of my little box, meaning I find myself outside of generals, colonels, and the intelligence team that I work with, and I find myself on a firing range surrounded by a bunch of infantry and artillery folks, not that they're any better or worse than I am, but or any of my colleagues, their backgrounds are typically a little different, their education may be a little different, and their mindset may be a little different, the responsibilities they have in the military to be on the ground in the face of bad guys all the time, so they just see the world a little bit differently. And I would say to you that their group mentality would certainly be different than mine. And I would have a difficult time spending a lot of time around them because I just wouldn't see the world in the same way that they do.
Yeah. And I totally relate to that. And like I said, was 41 years ago when I joined the fire service, just at 19. And I left 20 years ago. And yeah, there'd only be a handful of guys who thought like I did. And and that's not why I left, certainly not at all. I left to start another business and things like that. But yeah, I get it in those type of industries. And like I say, we only went to emergencies 3% of our working day. And the more often we went to, and that was always cyclic too. You'd go a month or two with nothing happening. And
Sure.
then we'd have, in a week, we might have 3 or 4 big incidents in that week. And that was fun. As much as people go, what? Like if someone's, a factory burnt down or something like that. Yes, it was horrible for the people involved, but for us, the camaraderie, the whole, like if we were going to emergencies 15, 20% of our working day, I mean, it would actually get stressful from that much of it. But it was, even those you didn't see eye to eye with around the station, we got on so much better. When we got back to the station, we were cleaning up, putting all the equipment back together and we'd been out and we'd expended a lot of energy. We'd brought a bad situation into a good, we'd quelled the whole problem, and it was a lot easier. So when there was months of, like we had 4 different shifts, and one shift would be getting all the jobs, and the other 2 shifts would be getting a share, and then one shift just for months would be getting nothing, and we'd be just like, oh, you
Mhm.
know, You
Yeah.
turn up for work, you get to work at 6 p.m. to do the night shift, and you'd say to the guys, "How's your day?" And they're like, "Oh, mate, we had this factory." And we go, "Oh, what?" And they tell you all about it, and then you'd still get nothing. You'd have these big droughts of nothing, because you live to do what you want to feel like you've done your job when you've finished your shift, but
Sure.
when nothing happens, yeah, it's harder to be on shift with those guys that you don't get on so well with when it's all downtime. Because there's a lot of really intelligent guys in the fire service, and when idle minds, they used to get up to mischief, like
Sure.
around the station, like big time, like really get in, But when there was a lot of activity and a lot of jobs and incidents, all the mischief stopped because they could expend all their energy on constructive stuff,
Sure.
yeah, so yeah, very interesting in those types of industries or employment uh, things. Yeah, interesting. Now you've started your own podcast, and it's tell us about sort of things you talk about on there.
Yeah. So, yeah, thanks for asking. I call it Headlines in History, and it's basically about foreign affairs, military conflict that is happening today, and that relates to the world today. But I like to bring those topics. I like to bring the histories of those topics along with it, and so the vision behind it really was trying to reach the audience that I know exists, that is that the type of audience that'll watch the evening news, and they'll see that there's something happening between Israel in Gaza, and they'll see that Iran had shot at Israel, and they have the basics down, and they're watching Lester Holt or whatever here in America on ABC or whatever, NBC, I think he's on. But anyways, but they want to know a little bit more because they don't obviously give you all of the detail. They surface stuff. But at the same time, they don't want to be a history professor, and they don't want a book on the history of the Middle East, right? That they've got other things to do, and they want to still go play basketball and raise their kids, right? So where's that middle ground? And that's what I try to provide. And so if somebody's interested in they want a little bit more than the 3 minutes of the news, and they just want somebody to sit down and say, okay, give me the half an hour, the crib notes, if you will, the summary on this whole thing, and how did this really start? And did it start back in? I'm referring to it as the Israel scenario. Is this, did it start in '79 when the Islamic Revolution took place in Tehran, or did it start a little bit earlier? Was it a World War I thing? And so I'll just bring that history along and have that conversation, and then I'll also, sometimes I'll give an assessment or a so what to something I think that may happen in that scenario going forward. All in my personal opinion. I clearly can't speak for the Army or any of those things, even though I work in those environments every single day and I have access to a lot of information that I can't discuss and all those things. But it doesn't mean that maybe assessments and opinions that we have on the work side aren't similar to what I think on the personal side and those kind of things. So we'll just chat about that. And sometimes I'll also bring in some personal experiences. So for right now, as a matter of fact, I'm going through like a mini series on the show where I'm discussing my deployment in 2005 to in Iraq. So how that started and why the unit even got there and why the National Guard was called to go to Iraq, and what the rotation was like, and some of the things that I learned, some of the funny stories and those kind of things. And it provides me an avenue to then discuss in an interesting way what the history of that war was, and why the United States and its allies in Britain and in Australia, obviously in our New Zealand, we were there, and why we decided to do that, and whether that was right or wrong, and all that stuff. So yeah, that's what I do, and I'll occasionally get into law enforcement stuff. I haven't done that too often yet, but I have plans to do that in the future. So talk about wiretaps and organized crime and narcotics stuff, but yeah, mainly just foreign affairs and military conflict and their histories.
Interesting. Yeah, very good. Yeah, and you're the first person I've ever talked to who's, does discuss that sort of stuff and has a podcast with it. Yeah, it's great. A great niche. Yeah, excellent. So I'll
Appreciate it.
have your contact info and stuff like that in the show notes. Is there anything we haven't talked about or covered that you'd like to talk about before we wind up?
Um, No, I think well, yeah, I think I can mention one thing. I Going back to empathy, one thing that's interesting, and people have asked me about this in the past. I think empathy is because it was so life-changing for me. I I'd like to express that empathy isn't just within the emotional world. And what I mean by that is people often refer to having empathy in caring for someone else who may be struggling, right? Like I want to look through their lens and I want to try to understand what their problem is, but what their struggle is. But empathy can be used in a whole variety of ways, in a whole variety of disciplines. I even use I teach soldiers to use the empathy construct when doing analysis on certain scenarios, because in anything that we're doing on the military side or the law enforcement side, we're really at the end of the day just dealing with humans. And so when we're having a discussion, let's say for example about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that decision was made by a human being in President Putin. And in order to really understand as best we can why things like that invasion occurred, you have to put yourself in his position and you have to look through Putin's lens and you have to understand what his history is and his vision of the world. And even though you're not doing that because you think he's a good guy and you want to fully understand him so you can like him, right? Or he could be a better person. That's all nonsense. I could care less about what happens to the guy in that way. However, it's easier for me to explain to commanders why he may be leading operations in Kharkiv one day as opposed to another location. And if there's no terrain reason or weather reason or force structure reason why he's choosing one oblast over another, it might be because he has a historical connection to one over the other, and something happened in his life. So I think you get the point. So it's not just that empathy is about understanding other people who are struggling. It could be used in a whole host of different ways, and it's really changed my life and my outlook in so many different things that I just hope that others can do the same thing and apply it to so many aspects of their life.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, he like if you studied history, you might know that he traveled through a certain town at a certain age and had a wonderful or an awful experience in that town, and it may
Of course.
taint what he emotionally, without him realizing, he could make a decision. And if you can analyze that and know, wow, his troops are approaching this town, and he's got a real emotional connection to this town that he didn't have in the last 5 towns that I'm aware of. There's something different's going to happen this time.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Interesting. Yeah, 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 yeah. And it can bring a lot of wisdom and yeah, and then help the intuition like at a whole different level because you're tapping into different stuff. Now you've already got a base of factual knowledge, and it's like, okay, I've got all these facts. How is this emotionally going to affect him? And you can tap in, and you could suddenly just be like, wow, Jon, where did you get that from? Yeah, yeah, interesting. Very good. Yeah, I've loved our conversation. It's given a whole different twist to intuition and having empathy for people and ourselves and how our lives roll and how we can evaluate that to make decisions that are helpful to ourselves and to others and the world in general.
Yeah, well, I'm glad. I appreciate you asking me to come along, and this has been fun. I've been looking forward to it for a couple of weeks now, and since the first time we talked, and yeah, I hope to provided value to you and the audience. It was certainly fun for me, and I appreciate you having me on.
Excellent. Pleasure. Thanks, Jon. Well, we're at the end of another thought-provoking episode. Remember to subscribe so you'll be alerted to new episodes. I want to say thank you to the men who are joining me on this journey of intuitive development. I truly hope our time together has expanded your reality and reinforced trust in your ever-reliable gut feeling. Embrace your intuition. It will not lead you astray. Until next time, stay tuned, stay curious, and trust your gut.